Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the CISO Corner, where we talk about all things data security and compliance. And I'm Dane Dittamore with DataBank, and I'm the Solutions Marketing Director here. Well, today's topic is comparing public versus private cloud security, and it can be somewhat controversial depending on who you are and your experience with cloud providers. One statement I think we can safely make is that there are differences between the two, but neither is necessarily more or less secure than the other. And as often said, it depends. Wouldn't you say, Mark?
It absolutely depends. So you're 100% right on that one, Dane. And I think part of the problem here is that, people still don't understand what the cloud is. They don't realize that the cloud is just a bunch. It is a bunch of servers that are out there run by another company. And then when you start going down to that next layer of understanding what the private versus public cloud is, that even causes more confusion, that are people that are not technology oriented, and they somehow think that one is completely different than the other. And we'll get into that a little bit, since we're going to talk about it depends, right?
Right, right. So, Mark, before we get into comparing public and private clouds, it seems we lay out some of the basic definitions because each of these may have nuances that cannot necessarily be labeled strictly public or private. So, can you give us some basic definition of who is typically responsible for each layer, maybe even describing the labor layers as per the OSI model?
Yeah, so we could do this a couple of different ways, and why don't we tackle it from both the OSI model real quickly, as well as kind of some definitions of maybe what the government like NIST defines the cloud as. So let's look at the OSI model first of all. So the OSI model is typically a network model, and in that you have 7 layers. You start out the very basics at the physical layer. You move up into logical layer, and so at layer 3 you're dealing with switching and hardware routing and things along those lines. And you move into some of the higher models, or higher layers of that model. You're dealing with the application. You're dealing with encryption and things, and so on and so forth along those lines. And I'm not going to go through each of the 7 layers. There's some mnemonics you can use to remember that and whatnot. But bottom line is, at layer 7 is where the application is at, and layer 7 is always going to be the customer, or in DataBank's environment, it's always going to be the customer's responsibility, because we call that the software as a service or application layer. Okay, and so that's where we kind of roll over into the NIST models. And so now I've kind of defined that, that with the OSI side of things. Let's define it from the NIST perspective, and let's bring the two of them together. So NIST says there's three types of cloud. There's infrastructure, platform as a service. So infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Okay, infrastructure being the hardware, typically the network, the things leading up to the hardware at the virtual machine level. Okay, so if we're looking at that from the OSI layer, you're looking at the routing, the switching, the intrusion protection systems, the firewalls, the DDoS protection. So really, you're looking at like layers 1 through 4, maybe, on that type of model. Then there's the platform as a service. Okay, and that's where the host operating system, or I'm sorry, the guest operating system on a virtual machine, for example, resides. And so you're talking about Windows and Linux and things along that in that space, and or perhaps a different type of operating system like Ubuntu or something along those lines. And so in an OSI model, you're switching over. If you're going to look at that, you're looking at probably maybe some of layer 4, 5, perhaps even layer 6 involved in that space. Then you move into that software as a service model, the SaaS model, and that's where you get layer 6 and layer 7 most typically. Sometimes even when you're dealing with encryption, you move down to layer 5 or layer 4. So you can see there's some kind of gray area in that. But bottom line is that your cloud providers will have some responsibility, and you'll have some responsibility. It's what we call the shared security model inside of these spaces. So focusing on the NIST side of things, at DataBank and in most cloud providers, and I'm not going to use other competitors' names, but you know who they are. Usually it's the customer that of those cloud providers that has responsibility for the SaaS layer. Now, in some cases where you have an actual SaaS provider, there's another customer layer underneath that, that's just the end user, if you will, or the consumer of the SaaS model. But at DataBank, the customer is always dealing with the SaaS side of things, and DataBank offers the infrastructure as a service or the platform as a service to our customers. So the platform as a service from a security perspective is where we put as much and most of our security as possible that we can share with the customer. Whereas the infrastructure as a service, there's quite a bit of the security that falls on the responsibility of the customer. So that's a long-winded answer because there's a lot of things to talk about when we're talking about describing these layers, but hopefully that gives the listener an overview of what we're talking about in those spaces.
Yeah. Well, Mark, that's an excellent overview. So can you describe some of the kind of the nuances that do not necessarily lend themselves to one or the other?
So a couple of those areas that are a little, we can call the nuances the gray areas, if you will. So for example, SQL Server, or maybe an internet information server or another type of web server. Where does that lie? Is that a platform as a service type of environment, or is that a SaaS environment? And that's a very good question. Depends on who your cloud provider is, depends on who, how you're operating in your cloud environment as to whether that is a customer space or not. So typically what a cloud provider is going to try and do is say that the database, so MySQL or SQL, for example, would be part of the application, and they're part of the software as a service models, the customer's responsibility. Now, what you can do to transfer that responsibility back to your cloud provider is to purchase a support plan, or a managed services type of support plan that would have that managed service provider actually take responsibility for the care and feeding of the database or of the web server, for example, the software that actually serves up the web. So you can do that. You can provide that to a customer
Yeah.
as a managed service.
Well, wouldn't you also say that there's a large community of professionals who manage or maybe co-manage certain elements along with the CSP, which kind of causes a lot of confusion?
It does, and that's where we have, you just mentioned CSP, the cloud service provider. There's also another group of people out there that you're talking about, the MSP, the managed services provider. Okay, so managed services provider will decide what product that they're offering and what they're going to manage on behalf of the customer. So what will happen with an MSP is that the let's say a SaaS model, a SaaS provider, a customer will come into a cloud service provider. And let's say the cloud service provider only provides infrastructure or maybe provides platform as a service and only deals with the operating system and laying down the hardened operating system, but the operations of that, the secure operations of that, on top of that, uh, that that um, that operating system, that's where it becomes challenging. So what a SaaS provider or even another group called the MSP, the managed service provider, may come in and say, okay, cloud service provider, you offer me the operating system, but I want this managed service provider over here to be the one that tweaks the system, that operates the security functions within the system, and make sure that everything is set the way it's supposed to be so that my SaaS offering is secure. So there's a whole new breed of people, not really terribly new, but it's come up in the last 5 years, managed service providers that will just handle all of that security or even the operations and maintenance that are non-security related for a cloud SaaS provider.
Yeah. So I think what you're kind of describing is there needs to be a shared responsibility model. And
There
so everybody has to be on the same page in terms of who manages what, right?
Well, that's the challenge within this whole environment is, it used to be in the enterprise world, You would have an IT team and perhaps maybe even sub teams underneath that. You may have a security team. A couple of the enterprises I've worked in, they would have a security team that would operate underneath the CISO, who would report probably to the CIO, and the CIO would also have a networking team, and they would have a server team, and they would have internal IT teams that all reported to that individual. So at some point, you come to the top of that pyramid, or top of that triangle. One person has some level of authority over everything that flows down underneath that. Well, in the cloud world, and that's the challenging piece, is that's not the case. You may have one top of a pyramid on the SaaS, over on the SaaS side of things. You may have another top of a pyramid on the end user consumer side of things. You may have a top of a pyramid at the managed service provider, and then another one at the cloud service provider. And somehow all of those folks need to be able to collaborate and communicate amongst each other in order to properly secure the environment. And actually, although the cloud is an absolutely wonderful advancement in technology, that's one of the areas that we've had a real struggle in from a security perspective, is making sure that all of those folks are talking to each other and they understand clearly that going to the cloud does not mean that the cloud is a turnkey solution for the end consumer or even the SaaS user or the SaaS consumer. It is actually a shared model. Everybody has to do their part in this somewhat of a decentralized type of solution.
Yeah, well, that really kind of confirms kind of at the outset the topic of the day, which is, just because you say or someone says public or private, neither
Mhm.
one is necessarily more or less secure. It really kind of comes down to who's responsible for what, and are they doing what they're supposed to be doing, right?
Exactly.
And accountable for
Mhm.
their piece of the pie. Well, we often see, another point, I guess, that I'd like to bring up is we often see that applications are developed in kind of what we would call a traditional public cloud, but they're also deployed there as well. And many times without evaluating all of the security considerations that need to take place.
Mhm.
And security is kind of an afterthought. So they develop it, they put it into production, and it really is kind of the developers that put the architecture together. And again, security is kind of an afterthought, and that can cause some real serious challenges down the road when they move on to other things. And now they've got a security exposure, compliance exposure, something like that. So talk about that a little bit, and maybe some pros and cons of getting it right from the outset and taking it from dev to production.
Sure. So getting it right from the outset, it's like building a house. Okay. If you don't set your house up with the proper framing, a building with a cornerstone, if you don't choose the right materials, say you choose wood to build a 30-story building and you really need is steel, that building's going to come down really quickly. If you don't set your cornerstone at the very beginning of building a building, your walls could be out of whack from one side to the other. And when you finally get around to the opposite side, you're realizing that they aren't coming together. You've got to go tear that thing down and rebuild it. So starting with a good foundation, a good understanding of what your application needs and what model you want to follow through on purchasing from a cloud service provider and potentially a managed service provider is absolutely essential. So that whole shared mindset has to be in existence at the very beginning of your entire process. If not, it's going to be a house of cards and it's all going to eventually come down. You're going to have problems down the road. You're going to have frustrations down the road. And more than likely, frankly, you're going to blame it on your cloud service provider.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds spot on, Mark. So what advice would you give our CISOs out there as they deploy applications? And you kind of mentioned that, but maybe as they consider repatriation of their clouds, right? So everybody's
Mhm.
taking a look at their spend, what is where, trying to get a handle on what is where. And a lot of them are, maybe from the financial aspect or whatever, saying, maybe we just bring this back in-house, or maybe
Yeah.
we consider some sort of a private managed hosting sort of an
Mhm.
environment. What advice would you give our CISOs out there?
Think twice. Part of the reason that people are thinking about repatriation, and let's just make sure everybody understands what we're talking about with that, is repatriation is exactly what you said. When they've thrown something up in the cloud, and I use that term deliberately, and I'll get to it in a second. They've thrown something up in the cloud, believing that it's more efficient, or believing that that they needed to for whatever reason, and then they're rethinking that and saying, "Hey, the cloud hasn't been working out for us for whatever reason. Now we're trying to bring it back inside of our enterprise. We're trying to bring it back inside." Okay. So if you're a CISO, that your IT department is talking about repatriation of the either the application or the data or both, we really need to start asking ourselves the question as to why. Is it because it was built incorrectly from the outset? Now we're seeing a lot of that right now, and this goes where I say throw it up into the cloud. We're seeing a lot of that consideration of repatriation right now, because 3 years ago at this very time, you might remember there was this thing called a pandemic going on. And a lot of customers, a lot of companies were unable to go into their offices where their applications were at, to do simple things like patching. And as they started coming out of that pandemic, they said, "Oh, well, we could have been, doing their debriefs and doing their after action reports." They said, "Hey, we could have been better off if we had this up in the cloud. It could have been more accessible. It had been up in the cloud. We had less downtime had it been in the cloud. We would have had less people that would have had to go into the office and expose themselves, had it." To the pandemic situation, had it been in the cloud. So they literally took an application that was designed for the enterprise and threw it up into the cloud and expected that would work. And so if you're going to talk about repatriation, consider the fact that over the past 3 years, you've made changes to that application, to that situation, that system that you threw up in the cloud in order for it to work better inside the cloud. And now you're going to bring it back into internally. Are you going to roll back everything that you configured for the cloud? Are you going to roll all that back to the way it was before, and make it more of an enterprise solution now? And you have to ask yourself, are you going to run into the same problems if we have a similar situation, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, with another pandemic or another situation that requires people from working from home and so on and so forth? So I really question the repatriation scenario. I question that, certainly it is right for certain companies, and bottom line is you have to assess properly whether it's right for your company. But reality is the cloud is here, and it's here to stay. At least, from a technology perspective, it's here to stay for at least probably the next 10 or more years. And what you need to do is you need to think about, hey, when I threw that application or that system up in the cloud, did I do it correctly? Instead of repatriation, you might want to consider rebuilding the product to meet the standards necessary to be in the cloud from the ground up, instead of just throwing something that used to be enterprise up into the cloud and not having that proper cornerstone, not having that proper structure behind it, taking into consideration all the things that are necessary in order to put it into the cloud. Now you can take a step back and do that, instead of repatriating, and you might be in a better off situation when something happens later on down
Yeah.
the road.
Well, that sounds like more than just food for thought. That sounds like if you are considering that, this information should spur an action plan. Now, if you're a listener and would like to be notified when the next CISO Corner podcast is released, just click subscribe button and the notification bell and on our YouTube channel. And if you have a topic you'd like that Mark and I should cover next time around, just drop us an email at CISO@databank.com. That's CISO@databank.com. And that's a wrap for today. And as always, be safe and stay secure.